this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Join us June 21st to 23rd with a hands-on workshop with Simon Levin and participate in a rocket kiln wood firing with Lisa Orr. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. We are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs with the best customer service and world-class workshops. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 513 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Kathleen Clark, who is an award-winning photographer whose career includes numerous exhibitions and serving as the photo director for Los Angeles Magazine and LA Weekly. Her series, The White House China, depicts historical events from each American president presented on their formal state dinnerware. In our interview, we talk about her inclusion in the Girl Artists of Portland, which was a performance art group active in the 1980s, and her practice of using ceramics as a staging ground for political commentary. If you'd like to check out her work, you can go to KathleenClarkPhoto.com. I did want to take a minute and thank some of the folks that have donated to our recent fund drives. We are listener-supported, so I'd like to thank Juliana Benson and Lynn Stonehouse for their recent contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can go to talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Also wanted to mention that I'll be teaching a hands-on workshop June the 8th and 9th at Mud Queen Pottery in Linglestown, PA. There are 2 spots available for that, so if you'd like to join us for the weekend, you can visit mudqueenpottery.com/workshops to register. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Let's start talking about your work with the Girl Artists of Portland, which was a collective group. You guys did performance art and some other things. So can you talk about that time in your life?
Yeah, it's funny, the group started, this was like in the 80s and in 1980 actually we met, but it was sort of a post-college, we'd all done different, worked in different medium. At that time, I transitioned out of ceramics and into photography, and there were some painters and drawers, and like 4 of us initially. And we had kind of met through a nonprofit gallery in town, and then just decided to have a critique group. And that's really all we meant to be. And then the woman who directed the gallery offered us space to do whatever we wanted in the summer when the space was closed. And we were like, okay, well, look, who's going to turn down a nice gallery space? So I don't know how it came about that we decided to collaborate on a project, but it was kind of like, we're not going to miss this, and let's just make something funny happen in the summer, And we did this really goofy project that my father said would ruin my career. And but what was, and it looked nothing really like any of the work any of us did. And it was a big installation of a beach party, a painted, crazy acrylic and Roplex giant beach balls. It was, silly but summer. And, the most amusing part of it, I remember, is having our tanning experience on the walls instead of CVs. So it was kind of like, the cooler of beer, and, it was just a really goofy thing to do. But what we came out of it was that we really enjoyed the process of working as a team, and finding different ways to work within that. And it was like, well, this is different and not isolating. And I don't know. At some point, we met another person, so we became five, and um, we got this idea of four of us. I was the only one not working in restaurants at the time, because we all had to have day jobs. And um, I was working at the Portland Art Museum in the film and video center, which, I was a receptionist at the time. But we all had worked in restaurants, and we just got this idea to do a giant restaurant installation. There was a restaurant downstairs from the gallery, and I think it must have just sort of like, let's make a restaurant and do a piece about artists working in restaurants as a survival. So sort of a worker thing. And it became sort of the bedrock for both our politics and crazy sense of humor, and which those things don't often, in art, don't really come together much. But we made this thing called Split Shift Cafe, which was, a completely fake restaurant where the audience sat at tables, and we made a lunch counter and an old bar, the kind of bar that's so spooky nobody wants to go into. But we served people and had an audio track. And at some point we were only going to do an installation, and then we realized we have to move in this thing, and because we weren't performers, but we have to make this has to be all encompassing, because we just wanted to, the thing that's maybe boring about art is sometimes all the negative space. You're making your picture or your pot, and it's like the only thing in the space, and we wanted to fill every corner. And so we did. And it was, a just really short performance, like 20 minutes. And I think we sold tickets for $2. and it became like the people's show in a way, and was really beloved. And we did it again in Seattle, and we got a food review, a restaurant review. The opening weekend in Portland. And, it was this kind of silly but smart and, worky thing, which then, was a shot of adrenaline, where I just felt so much more like we could make work that was really all consuming and powerful and funny at the same time. And so we did that together for, I can't remember now, 6 performances or something over 8 years. And last year, I've been carrying around archives for years, all of our stuff, and not all of it, because we got rid of most of the set pieces, but a lot of the documentation. And it was welcomed into the archives at the Smithsonian Institute, the Archives of American Art. So, researchers, if anybody ever cares about, performance art, in the minutia in the Northwest, they'll find us. And, but that was really a nice thing for all of us to, as we get older, to like have this, where can this work go? And because we weren't in New York or Los Angeles, it was a more minor news market. And so sort of getting a little niche in history was, it was a nice thing. So when we all pooped out on, we all got tired of having stage fright and whatever, all the stress, because we were doing 2 jobs at once. They all kind of went our separate ways. And I'd been working at the film center at the museum for 6 years at that point, and I'd gotten promoted to do publicity, so I knew, more. That actually helped the girl artists a lot, and everything I ever did afterwards, because it just was so helpful in terms of promoting anything or art-wise. And I was really interested in film and at the time, and I thought, maybe I could work in the art department in film. So I moved to LA and worked for a year and as a set dresser in films, which was like, the hardest thing on the planet, because it's crazy hours. And I think, I was maybe 32 then, and I thought I need to be 20 to do this job. It's like, it's just narcolepsy. And it was a little more boring than I expected. A lot of waiting for other people to do stuff, but it was just, I thought I gotta go, I need to back into an art world that's more familiar to me, and also in a way more stimulating, because when you do other work, you're just all consumed, whether it's working for somebody else or yourself. But when you're waiting on people, I find that challenging. um and anyway, but I was in LA, and I got a couple other jobs managing a film festival, um, artistic directing the Women's Building Gallery in its last year, and then that was on its way to folding when I sort of took over at that point. And I tried to save them, and I couldn't do it. I ended up going back to grad school, thinking I would teach or hopefully or curate or whatever and make art. And it was nice to make art again. But it was interesting. I guess it became fascinating to me how all these stepping stones kind of led one thing to another. When I finished grad school, I assisted a photographer for a while in editorial photography, and so we were, I was helping, do assignments for magazines, and a job came open as photo editor at the LA Weekly, and I always say that I just sort of sweet talked my way into that job, because I had no journalism experience other than, kind of lugging some camera cases around for another photographer. But had worked with the art museum to publish promo stuff for the film festivals. And so I knew some layout and had a couple of photos with images. And anyway, I got hired, and I really loved it. And it was kind of fascinating because in art making for oneself, I know, especially when I went to grad school, it was at UC Irvine, at University of California, Irvine, which had just, was a great little program, 10 grad students, and in a giant school, but at 10 grad students and a very smart faculty. But it was very avant-garde, and I spent more time thinking about the work and planning it and trying to figure out what is it, how to make an image, how to really make an image, and not making so much. And the journalism was kind of great. It's just like, get off your butt and go. You don't have, we had the big earthquake out here, and it was like, oh wait, I have to assign that, and I have to go out there and take pictures too. It was sort of all this immediacy, which was really different. And I loved finding the right photographers to do other assignments, and picking shots, and that ended up being, and the collaboration with writers. I hadn't anticipated that, but the whole working with a lot of smarty pants people was really satisfying. And learning about LA, and like from labor protests to, we have it all. We had it all, riots and all within the first couple of years I was doing that. And it was, that part wasn't so much fun, but it was fascinating. And really all aspects of photography. And I went to, after I was there like 6 years, and I had a chance to sort of step up and got a job at art directing the photos for Los Angeles Magazine, which was just, a shinier, more meticulous sort of coverage of the city. Not maybe as much fun, because the weekly was really renegade. And it's like, what can you do for $100, which is actually also a girl artist kind of thing. It's like, how can we do this stuff on the cheap? And sometimes you get really creative when you do that stuff. The monthly magazine, it was a lot more care and perfectionism, which, was gratifying in some levels. I learned a lot of skills about making things better. Like, I don't think I used to like to rework work do it more than once so much. And now it's like, oh no, it's not good enough. Go again, do it over. And I'm fine with it now. But it, it's interesting how those things evolve.
Well, I would imagine that the pace of LA Weekly, because it's so fast in terms of your deadline, you're working what, a week ahead to get out a weekly
Yeah.
magazine?
And in the rare occasions I had a chance to work, further out on a longer story, or to, couple photographers together that might work together over a period of time, and I could kind of check in on what was going on. But a lot of stuff was just like, okay, send somebody for, Tuesday at 10 p.m., and turn it around. We had our own dark room, and that, was terrific to be able to have that sort of immediacy. But it was really different than kind of high end, slower jobs, bigger budgets, and more risk. I always thought, oh, you'll have so much time at a monthly to really consider, to get it right, and consider it. But it was like, it was so much potential for overthinking also, which, you know, ended up being great in a lot of places and exhausting in a lot of others.
Can I ask you a question about your choices as the photography director? So let's say, for instance, the riots or the Rodney King beating, like these things it's violent, like these could be very violent direct images, or they could be more subtle. So how do you determine like what's going in the magazine?
At a certain point, didn't have a lot of control over that. There's an editorial board or editor and an art director who, carries more weight at a certain point. I'm kind of more involved in the forming of it, and then I was, I try to like, I have my own, everybody will say, oh yeah, you have a lot of control freak streak, but but I could shape it more in terms of what I offer up, like here's a bunch of choices and you can head in different directions with the work. But we weren't into, it's very different than now. We weren't very into publishing blood, guts, and hair, we were trying to present objective journalism and be artful when possible. There was something left to be imagined, I think, whereas now we're super sated with imagery. So we kind of seen it all at this point. But anyway, I did that for 8 years, and then the economic blow of 2008 sort of gutted the magazine staff. And I was, one of the people with a good view out my window. So I went, and then I started trying things because I thought, oh crud, I'm like 50 years old, and uh, what's my tool set? Oh, pottery. I don't, I can't do that now. I started a little photo gallery that it was like a no overhead situation in another local business with a good space. But I did that 2 times in like over a 6-year period trying to make it go. But I realized with galleries I could make good shows, get people there, but I wasn't really great at selling. There were a couple of shows that sold themselves, but it wasn't really, I'm a little more probably too introverted for that. Um, and I started freelancing a little bit here and there, doing photo editing for other photographers, and for Sunset Magazine, I freelanced for doing their travel section for a few years. And then I just kind of decided okay, I'll just essentially retire and work in my work. But I was going to say, I forgot about this, but the best thing that happened after I left Los Angeles Magazine was that all of a sudden, what art was flooding into my head. And it wasn't like when I, was in grad school and I'd sit and think about work forever and not quite figure out how to make it. I just got fully developed ideas. And I think the combination of all the stimuli from my existence and maybe age, I don't know, it's like one thing to look forward to is sometimes you get better ideas as you get older. But I just started thinking art all the time. I didn't care as much about putting it out into the world, so I just started making stuff. And again, like, okay, I don't have a full income that I used to have. I'm gonna like do things on the cheap and figure out how to do that and become, sort of as self-sufficient as I can be. So that kind of, I did a few bodies of work and in between, a couple of galleries and a couple of bodies of work until about 2015 when I started to work on what led to the White House China.
We're going to talk about that, but I wanted to back up and think about in your time in photography, things really changed from manual photography to digital. How did you as an artist make that transition? Because I feel like the work now lends so much to the digital nature of it, but what was it like back then?
Well, in let me think, in the 90s and at LA Weekly, the photographers, everybody was shooting film and transparency, and the photographers started to freak out because the rumors about digital were creeping in, and everybody felt like it was going to be an alien language, and there was like oh no, the wheel on my bicycle's being reinvented. And also I think people just loved the sort of process and the old, I don't know, back up a second. I was thinking about, I remember I was teaching, I taught night classes at USC in beginning photography, and to that end, that the students, when they would develop their first roll of film, and the darkroom, it's like this weird magical thing that happens. It's like you add a chemical to this piece of plastic and it turns into pictures of your family, and that was like, that part is a romance that I think takes people back, at least in our generations that grew up with, not the generations now that grew up with cell phone photography, but people who grew up with, family pictures. There's a multiple layers of nostalgia and charm, and and his coupled with history. So it was hard for people to give up. Plus, I think that it also at the time represented um further investment. People were living, it wasn't like editorial photographers were making a truckload of money and they, having to buy another, $1,500 camera or something, not to mention lenses, was going to be a thing. So I don't remember being personally reticent so much as I remember everyone else being reticent. And so that, I mean, that kind of felt like it was in the air. And then by the time I was at the magazine, more like people still were shooting high-end film, and a lot of the famous pictures you see on billboards, a lot of those photographers were billboards and what's left of magazines and Showtime, and it worked with a lot of those people who make stuff for HBO and Netflix photo shoots, and those people were still shooting transparency, and it's a really much harder process, but to get it right. But they gradually started to, realize that, it's like, okay, I'm gonna learn this. And so it was interesting because one thing on a photo set, like if you're shooting a high-end, shoot of, we'll use a contemporary, Megan Thee Stallion or something, photo shoot with someone at that level, or I don't know who else, but that the shoot now, in the past, the photographer had a little bit of privacy. You've got an entourage of people on set, including the publicists for the talent, and you were able to sort of not have to show them everything. They might have seen a Polaroid, but now with digital, people have it their cameras are plugged into screens, so there's laptops or big screens on sets, and all of a sudden it was all there was a lot of intervention from publicists, which were pretty controlling anyway. Um, and so it became a new machine to navigate, I think. So in that set, for the producers, it became different. I don't think for the audiences so much, except that then that coupled with the invention of the iPad and the evolution of cell phones, and then all of a sudden, I mean, I knew wedding photographers who no longer could do shoots because, which had really lucrative careers until the iPhone was in. Every picture that you're trying to take is either ruined by cell phones, or people don't think they need a wedding photographer because their friends can shoot it on their cell phones for free. So it's the photography world's been decimated, I swear. But still, people seem to love making stuff, images, and it's like in ceramics, everything. There's a world of automation out there, and then there's the world of people who still love getting their hands into the mud and making the chemistry, and it's pretty great when it's challenging, but you embrace it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Well, you mentioned that in 2015, the ideas that became the White House China series were kind of percolating. Can you talk about going to DC and sort of that early research time of having those ideas formulate in your mind?
I was like probably everybody and their dog, but maybe a little more so because I couldn't let go of the bone. I was, it sounds naive now given all that we know about what's happened in this country, but I was just mortified by the speak and during the presidential campaign of 2015, and how coarse it was, and how any rule of argumentation and any therapist in America is going to tell people not to talk this way. Your mama taught you how not to behave, and yet all of a sudden a huge crowd of people were embracing this. And this was, in a country where the country participated in a lot of horrible things, and yet still somehow had this framework of an idyllic kind of goal. I don't know that we've ever fully been able to achieve the goals, but we've had an idea about striving for better and an embrace of beautiful language. And it all really bugged me. I couldn't, I didn't know what to do with it. And I just closed my second little photo gallery in Hollywood, and I was kind of itching for a project, and I decided I didn't know anything really, besides the news. And I decided to go to Washington, D.C. because I'd never been. It was kind of coinciding with looking into my own family's history. My dad grew up in extreme, a rural West Virginia in a holler, grandparents had a small tobacco farm on completely primitive hillsides. And I, began along with my brothers to wonder how how they ended up there, what the evolution was like, and where they traveled from, and then I thought, DC, I might be able to learn some of all of this stuff a little bit and research a little. And Obama was still in the White House, and I thought, okay, now's the time to go. So we did a lot of tourist things, but kind of with a much more heavy researcher nerding out. Like I discovered all these little small collections and big collections, and I was taking pictures, but kind of as note keeping more than anything. I was sort of thinking I would look for kind of the graphic manifestations of our national story, like the ideas about democracy, the ideas about, humanity and sort of striving for better, and find that in architecture and sculpture and whatever was there. And then I also, stumbled on little collections, like there's the Daughters of the American Revolution, which had a fascinating mini museum and sets and, room sets of, former fake life, right? and of course there's dishware and that stuff. And I wasn't looking for China, but China was in every, like at Smithsonian, they had a big representation of the presidential China, and I'm staring at these things and taking pictures of them. I brought them home. I was looking, I think it was George Washington's blue and white plates, and I just started to think about, the imagery, that most of those were just patterns, but some of the plates had figures in them, and I started to see what else might go into those, like how to tell another story. And was it like 30 years ago? More than that, I think. I went to a flea mart in Long Beach, California. It was a hot day on an airplane tarmac. They had this flea mart, and I was with a friend, and we found this box of it was like a 1960s Black History slideshow, like from a university, and there were all these illustrations in it of mostly of slavery and slave hunting, like in Africa, but old illustrations, and it was like $10. And I thought, this isn't right to have this sitting out here in the sun. And I bought it and thought that I'd probably donate it somewhere. But then I never really figured out where to do that, or that it was even worth. It was kind of a jumble. It was out of sequence, and I don't know if everything was there. But I just carried it around with me. It was in my basement, and I went down and started pulling slides and scanned a few and put an image in the middle of George Washington's of something that would have been taken made at about the same time, or about the same time as Washington's administration. And it was of a African man, strapped to a post in a slave market. And I just, turned it blue, made it blue and white. And I was using crummy, just photocopy at my house, nothing. It was really rough and ugly. And I thought, but it was a horrible image. And it was also made me laugh, because it was like, when you figure something out and it works, but it's sort of dumbly manifested, it seemed like, oh my God, this is something larger. And I was still kind of thinking it would be a part of an overall series that had architecture and other elements of actual places, like a mix of documentation and just sort of telling one part of the story. And then gradually over months, I realized, I could tell the entire story of the presidency in that mode, and began to add a little text as a caption at the bottom, which identified each president, and if they were slaveholders, mentioned how many slaves they owned and what years of their term. And then if it wasn't a slaveholding president, a kind of naming whatever other atrocity or just kind of awful thing, dumb decision, in some cases. So there's a bit of it's like a little bit of an educational tour. But the hard thing in researching it was like, I'm interested in history, but I'm not a historian. So my my ability to grasp everything was, somewhat superficial. So, and then just trying to figure out for every president, both what dishes they used and what were their, Achilles heels, I guess. Because I think what led me to that initially was I was just curious what people ate. What, I'd heard about Thomas Jefferson and a love of ice cream and figuring out how to make an ice cave to make ice cream, which is crazy. But what they ate kind of, led to more nuances around the dishware. And there, it was interesting that, most of the presidents didn't have just China sets made. They would use previous sets, and they're very expensive. So they would use previous sets, or sometimes use their own family's china. So some of the White House chinas on patterns that were family china or campaign china was a thing also. That was like a souvenir fundraiser kind of thing. So it was interesting to figure out that stuff and try to keep historically, I didn't put Woodrow Wilson eating off of Bill Clinton's china. I tried to fit the period. One thing was super interesting is that a couple years after the Washington trip, I went with my younger brother to Virginia and West Virginia to kind of explore both some projects we were both wanted to work on, and also just family stuff. But we went to the Reeves collection, which is at Washington and Lee University in Lexington. And admittedly, we were drawn to Lexington because we wanted to eat at the restaurant that kicked, what's her name? I forget her name now. The press, Trump's press agent out. I forget her name, the governor of Arkansas, whoever she is. Anyway, we wanted to eat there, but there's this great museum, this little museum that has the historic China collection, and they have all this antique political creamware and decal transfer stuff, which was fascinating because there were a few presidential things in the collection, and there were also a couple of pieces of what was it called? Abolition pottery that was made to there, images of slavery on dishes, like teacups for children, and they were both to teach people about the horrors of slavery and also, I think, raise money for abolition causes. And so I was like, I had already made a plate, I think, for James K. Polk with a really famous image now of Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? And it was, a woman in shackles, Black woman in shackles, begging to be free. And there were images that were essentially like Wedgwood, I think, had made, or Staffordshire had made Jasperware slave medallions. And it was kind of like, okay, I'm making what they did 200 years ago, and I felt like I was really on the right track. But it was also, oh my God, same thing over and over again. We just repeat our cycles of, xenophobia and racism and war and, all of it. So, but it's fascinated me and kind of helped me continue to build upon this whole complicated thing that became the White House China. And it was interesting moving from the period of early political illustrations, which I should have said this, that what I used were the historical, images of plate rims, some of which I kind of painted because I didn't really have more than much of a description. But so the presidential China plate rims, and then I put other images into the middle. And then I realized that making a photographic print of that in glass looked pretty much like the surface of a glazed porcelain dish. So I'm just like, could go to the lab, print out pictures of plates at 9 inches, like a standard kind of plate size, and bring them home, cut them out with scissors, and stick them on a plate stand or on silk or on satin, and photograph them as though they were in some small collection somewhere in the world. And it really looked, was it, except for some of the images are kind of askew. There's like angle weirdnesses, which I actually sort of like because I want people to linger, and forces your eye to kind of sit there and think about the thing a hair longer than, we're really trained to move on fast now. But all that was really fun to develop and, figure out how to do this. And, it's very pre-AI. It's just a couple of years ago, and I wouldn't do AI anyway. I kind of like the GarageBand method a little more, like a little crafted peculiarities.
So it's a fully photographic process, but you've mentioned it a couple times, like way back in the day, you had made pots, like you had worked in ceramics.
Not that well. Yeah, I could throw a 10-inch cylinder. I could make plates.
You're familiar with the decorative language of ceramics, and I think that informs the way you stage the photographs. It informs just your understanding of ceramics as a status symbol, because that's what I was thinking as I was, because this is in a book form. People can find the book or find images from the book. But a lot of these plates, like, they're high class objects, I didn't write down which ones, but some of them have, gold luster along the rim and then an image on the inside that is a stark contrast.
Yeah.
Something that is a horrible event. So can you talk about understanding sort of the materiality of ceramics and how that helped you to build the photos in terms of the content of what you wanted to say?
Well, one thing is sort of understanding the charms of a dinner party. I started to think about how the White House China was kind of a soft form of diplomacy, that it could be used. Well, actually today in the news, there's photographs of a state dinner that the Bidens had for Tokyo, for Japan. And I was like, oh, it's George Bush's plate in the shot, but it was like, it was, we don't see those images very often, but they're used in that world as diplomacy, because agreements and conversations and relationships are built over a meal. Like anything we do, if you have dinner with somebody, your conversation is more deep, that's less superficial, and I think that China, it was, discovered kind of early on that it had that potential to make this world a little more grandiose. It's interesting. When I went to the White House, I was like, oh my God, it's so stodgy. The taste was so fascinatingly like prim and weird now, And I mean, I like old stuff, but boy, it was like the little, like the red room and the blue room, and they're all very, cookie cutter. It's, the formality of it was interesting. When I was a teenager, my parents stopped doing, my father stopped doing his regular job, and he was like a retail clothing manager and distributor and stuff. And my parents, they bought an old house at auction, and went to an auction for the furniture too. And they got totally seduced in this process of antique auctions and started buying stuff they didn't need. And then, we had these enormous garage sales, and eventually they became antique dealers. And the whole language of the beautiful object. And my younger brother does this now still, but not the garage sales, but buying and selling. And the language of looking at, ceramics or glass and checking the maker's marks and all those materials were really familiar to me, even though my parents didn't deal in fine china per se. But it was just an orientation of this is a valuable commodity, and I wanted the work to look really pristine and formal, like it's in, well, I think I said this, but like in a collection somewhere, even without showing that collection. But it was interesting because a few people thought, were trying to encourage me to make actual plates of it. And I found myself balking, and not that I don't love objects, but I just felt like, well, I'm trying to create an environment, a world in which a fictional world in which these things live, not just put this thing that is so familiar that it's, commodifiable and on this, sort of on a pedestal somewhere. And it felt in a way less artful to me to do that than it did to make its own world and keep it in photography. So I resisted. But I mean, I know you could do that, but it's difficult to also convey all the information that needs to go into it. You take a single plate away and take the text off, and all of a sudden it could look racist and not like a critique of racism, but or of the nuclear bomb or whatever else. But that was an interesting thing to realize. And I remembered looking back in the 70s, 80s, I guess, of Howard Kotler's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The decal American flags and Blue Boy, that stuff. And, he's the first one I could think of that did that, the decal imagery on plates and, did it well. And and I kind of felt like, after that, I've seen it a lot, a lot of people do it. And I don't mean to criticize it, but I felt like it became repetitive to me to use that format, at least for this work.
Also, because you're an amazing photographer, like that is now the medium. Why not use photography as the thing that you're the master of?
Well, it's a control freak environment for sure. Especially, I mean, I made this I finished it right before COVID. And, in a way it was like, okay, if it didn't, I was, somewhat aware of how difficult it is to get work seen. It might not have an audience, it might not, I may not feel like pushing for a gallery show, I kind of am not that, I get very television and just want to make stuff, but it would be easy for me to get stuff seen, at least on the internet, sometimes I make stuff and I made one whole series just to publish on Instagram and not care that, because I mean, to be honest, so many galleries, including the ones that I ran, you could have 5 people a day in a gallery if you're lucky. And it's not that, I mean, it's hard to, there's actually, it's been nice to do this show at Candela Gallery in Richmond, which is up still, I should say, through the 20th of this month. But because it was in conjunction with the NCCA conference, a ton of people came through, and it'd be like 10 people would come in and then they'd leave and 12 more would come in and the doors swinging, and that was a really nice, fresh audience to just know is seeing the work, and I mean, my orientation wasn't selling, but it was exciting. I actually sold some work, and it's, I wasn't sure that political work was marketable, and a handful of things sold, which is great.
I think at the heart of the work is questioning the American myth, because
Yeah.
what the political narrative is and what the political reality is are always different. We know that. But as human beings, just knowing that what we're being told is not exactly what happens, it doesn't drive home the emotional point that your work does. So let's think about the George Bush piece. So there's a George Bush plate, and it's an image of a detainee from Abu Ghraib prison, which those images were like a really flashpoint in American public history because it was showing like, oh, actually, we were torturing detainees and they took photos of it. So like there's an emotional potency when you put that on a plate that's different than if I just read about that in a news article.
I mean, my dad said to me once, he said, like, thing about history is you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. I know there's a lot of argument in the country for, not wanting to rake ourselves through the coals endlessly. And I'm not interested in that either, but I think it is important to know what we've done and how, when we become as a country complicit. I mean, there's definitely issues going on in the world right now. I won't go there, but we can do better. We should do better. And I think knowing that is power. Not knowledge is power. It's hard. It was hard for me to like want to do anything critical again about certain precedents, like, and I mean, I find that on even another project that I've been working on where I like the subject and I don't want to do I don't want anything bad to be here, it's like, we're human. We want our protagonist to be like, or whatever it is, I'm probably opposite now, to be all, good, but I gradually have gotten better at like letting the hard parts show. I mean, George Bush was, a crackpot, kind of a lovable crackpot, but boy, what a series of mistakes.
Well, let's contrast him with someone like Jimmy Carter, because I had read in an article that you
That
had
one
a
was
hard
tough.
time. Yeah, can you talk about that because you did like him?
Yeah. Well, Jimmy's kind of like everybody's lovable president now, but I couldn't figure out where the negative. I mean, not every president had a negative, and I'll come back to Jimmy, but John Quincy Adams was actually, argued for escaped slaves. He was a lawyer, and he argued at the Supreme Court and was able to free escaped slaves from a famous ship. They made a film on it, blanking on the word, but he did a good thing, and that's great. I decided to let that be. Most everybody, even great presidents, did something, not so great. Jimmy Carter, I really had to dig deep. I mean, I had a friend who's a film critic, a well-known film critic, and just an astute critique. And I was trying to figure out where to go. I had her look at all the images when I was nearly finished, and she's like, I think Carter had a hand in Afghanistan. And it was like, oh yeah, I kind of blanked. And so I really had to dig into some spots where I just couldn't find the information readily. Um, and so, there was a role with Carter and, funding the CIA and Afghanistan, and that, there's good things too, but this we were talking about parts of the presidency where we got ourselves into worse trouble than or just despicable acts. But so it was, I mean, Bill Clinton, I've got the image of Monica Lewinsky's dress, which was like, I always thought of that piece as kind of like a weakness for women, and it was a super big weakness at the time. It's like, how do you let yourself do this when you're kind of a very intelligent president? And but these things you just sort of have to like take a look because they're important. And I still hold out hope we can figure out how to do better collectively and see each other.
One of the powerful images was the one that represents Hillary Clinton, and
Yeah.
it's a smashed plate on the ground.
Yeah, and she wasn't a president, she was a candidate and a lot of other things, but it kind of felt like I used Clinton China for that. The Clintons did have a set of China made, and I just thought this sort of shattering of, both perception about what everybody thought was going to happen and what really happened, and I thought it needed to be in the discussion. There's kind of a form of, for the 40, where are we now, 46th president we're on, for the last 46 terms, that like where the plates, move along in a general direction of like what's a story in the middle of the plate and for each term. But as you get into the 1900s, the photography became more part of modernity, and I was trying to figure out how to keep China looking like China and still have images of photography creeping in. And then I think I hit Vietnam, and there were 4 presidents in a row that had some hand in Vietnam. And I thought, okay, we can just let them all have the same image, which was a battlefield cross, a gun with a helmet. And that sort of shook the form up a little, which made me feel like then I could get away with sticking Hillary in there as a broken piece, because it's partly about broken hope and that kind of thing as well.
Well, this project took the form of a book, and we've referenced that people could purchase the book and read the book.
Yeah, I'm doing a waiting list now because I did sell out the initial run. I didn't do a huge production, but I may publish again, hopefully in the next 6 months or so.
What do you think the power of the project is in the book format versus, I saw individual photographs that were installed in a gallery. Do you see a difference between that?
Well, when I made it, I thought it's a lot of pieces because of each president. So I made it, one can do that with a book more readily than taking over an installation space. I think there's 20 pieces, I think, on the walls in Richmond, and then more in a box there. But I could run everything, show everything, and a little bit of atmosphere in the book. So I liked the intimacy of holding a book in your hand and kind of gradually absorbing it. There's a lot more space that can be created that way. But I did always envision it, like the prints in Richmond are at 11 by 14 inches wide by 11 high, and that creates a plate that's, it's essentially like a placemat size. It's very intimate and familiar. So I kind of was thinking about all these things. But the book is a nice small shape. I think it's funny. We're in an era where people think art needs to be big because it can be, but it's sort of like, well, why is it so big? People have room on their shelves for a book this big, and not necessarily, enormous things. And it's I don't know, I was juggling with all those kind of ideas.
The thing that the book format does for me is it puts it in the context of history more, because this is a reclaiming of the national narrative in some ways. So in a book format, and I think it's because my wife's a historian, so we have books everywhere in our house. Like, to me, it's a photographic document that puts it in that real world, even though you've created another world. It puts it in the real world context in an interesting way. Yeah,
and there are several books on the actual White House China. So in a way, adding this one more to it that basically screws around with the whole narrative is sort of like, it's another little fake world. It's like Back to the Girl Artist. Let's make our own story version of this. I mean, in a way, in my head, I thought, oh, wouldn't this be great as its own little house museum? You go into these little rooms and it's set in a certain way, but it's like the book became a way to kind of have that absorbing space. And I'd never worked in that format before either. And it was kind of nice I mean, except in publishing, coming out of magazine but it was nice to sort of treat that as a canvas, 100 pages or something.
To wrap up, can you plug your website and social media if you want to, so people can see more of these images?
Sure. I am at Kathleen Clark, that's KATHLEEN, photo, PHOTO.com. There's a link on the bottom of it to my Instagram account. I keep private because I don't like trolls. So you have to prove yourself a normal person before I let you into my weird club, but where you'll see too many pictures of lovely botanical things and my garden or something and some weird art.
Well, thanks so much. This has been great. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was fun. It's nice to talk to you. And thanks to whoever's going to listen to this for putting up with it. Thanks, Ben.
I'd like to thank Kathleen for coming on the show. I rarely get to talk to photographers, so it was interesting to talk about her approach and how she uses ceramics in her work. I also wanted to take a minute and thank today's sponsors. That includes the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Bray Clay. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor on one of our podcasts, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.